Mace Windu channeled dark side emotions every time he drew his lightsaber, and the Jedi Council called it mastery. Count Dooku watched the same man do the same thing and called it proof the Order was already lost. That reading is analytical rather than documented in a single canonical scene. Dooku never named Windu as his reason for leaving in any source that survives. What the record does contain is something more durable than one scene. A complete account of the institutional rot Dooku spent 4 decades cataloging. And Vapad turns out to be the sharpest single illustration of that rot the Order ever officially endorsed. Whether he named Windu specifically when he walked out, the evidence he left behind points in one direction with unusual precision. If you've been following the Clone Wars chronological series, the Year 1 through Year 4 playlist is pinned below. You've already covered Mace Windu and Form 7 from the Council's perspective. That episode examined what the Order chose to authorize. This one inverts the camera. Same institution, same evidence, different eyes. Dooku's eyes. Both playlists are in the description, and this one stands alone. But together they cover the same argument from opposite ends. Begin with the forms. The Jedi had 7 lightsaber combat philosophies, and each one represented a different answer to the same foundational question. What should a guardian of peace actually be when the lightsaber comes out? The 7 forms constitute something close to an institutional record, a document of what the Order believed combat was for, what emotional state the practitioner should bring to it, and what kind of relationship a Jedi should have with the violence they were sometimes required to use. The answers varied so dramatically across the spectrum that sitting the forms side by side reads almost like a debate the Order was having with itself about its own nature. At opposite ends of that ideological spectrum, separated by 5 forms and a philosophical distance that is hard to fully overstate, sat 2 that define the argument this video is building. Form 2, Makashi. Form 7, Vapad. Both products of the same institution. One faded quietly from active use. The other was certified by the Jedi Council as an authorized variant of a form they had already formally prohibited. Form 2, Makashi. Its full canonical designations include the Way of the Ysalamiri and the Contention Form. The name signals the purpose precisely. Makashi was designed for contention, specifically for the tactical problem of one lightsaber meeting another in a focused duel between skilled opponents who both understood what they were doing. It was built as a direct answer to Form 1, Shicho, which had been designed for crowd control through wide, sweeping motions. Shicho worked against multiple opponents in chaotic space. Against a single skilled adversary who moved in tight, patient angles, it was inefficient and predictable. Makashi answered that inefficiency by inverting every design principle Shicho was built on. Not power, precision. Not force, economy of motion. Not expansive sweeping arcs. Controlled strikes calibrated to specific vulnerabilities. What Makashi looked like in practice was immediately distinctive. Practitioners operated in a narrow physical footprint, moving through deliberate, calculated lines rather than expansive position changes. The blade work was tight. A Makashi practitioner didn't swing wide and correct. They placed each strike with what the lore records as unerring precision in every movement, with immaculate footwork anchoring each exchange. The defensive strategy was built on what might be called negative space, on not being present when a strike arrived, rather than meeting force with force. Makashi's defense was sufficient against most conventional attacks, and deliberately limited against highly kinetic, power-driven assault. The form wasn't designed to overpower anyone. It was designed to expose the mathematical inefficiency in an opponent's approach, the recurring error in their footwork, the slight overcommitment in their guard, and place a single, precisely calibrated counterstrike into that gap before the opponent could correct. 3 words circulate in the lore as the form's operational philosophy, attributed to Dooku's own approach to it: finesse, artfulness, economy. The form has been described by its practitioners and analysts as the most elegant of the seven, not as aesthetic praise, but as a precise description of functional efficiency. In Makashi's framework, elegance was the operational definition of minimum necessary force. Every movement that wasn't serving a specific tactical purpose was surplus, and surplus, against a skilled opponent, was information they could use against you. This is what it felt like to watch Dooku fight. Not aggression, not the performance of dominance, but a patient, focused process of identifying exactly where the other person kept making their mistake, and being in exactly that position each time they made it again. The form suited a particular kind of mind, the mind that approaches a problem analytically, locates the precise point of failure, and stops there, without adding anything unnecessary. Dooku was one of the finest Makashi practitioners the Order ever produced, described canonically as having mastered the form at its highest levels. He later trained Asajj Ventress in it after leaving the Order. She became formidable, but sources make the distinction explicitly. Hers was less elegant than her master's. Makashi could be learned. What Dooku brought to it exceeded the technical requirements by enough that even his own student, working from the same instruction, couldn't close the gap. Makashi fell out of favor in the Order, and the reason is worth understanding, precisely because it reveals something about how institutions process irrelevance. The form wasn't abandoned on ideological grounds. The Council didn't look at Makashi's principles and find them troubling. It faded because the threat landscape changed. After the Sith's defeat at the Battle of Ruusan, the practical need for lightsaber-on-lightsaber single combat diminished substantially. The dominant threats Jedi faced daily were blaster fire and multiple simultaneous opponents, two categories where Makashi's single-opponent precision design left it poorly suited. The form gradually became what its records describe as a training exercise. Not rejected, not criticized, made practically irrelevant by a shift in what the Order was encountering, and quietly filed away. The form built on analytical precision, controlled technique, and the removal of all unnecessary motion faded from active use. Hold that against what the Order was actively endorsing at the same time. Form 7, Vapad. Named after a creature native to the planet Serapin, co-created by Jedi Masters Mace Windu and Sora Bulk in the later years of the Galactic Republic, making it, historically, one of the newest combat disciplines in the Jedi tradition, developed in what turned out to be the institutional twilight of the Order's final decades. To understand what Vapad was, you first need to understand what it was built on top of. Form 7 in its base expression was called Juyo. The Order had a specific and unambiguous institutional position on Juyo: banned. Not restricted to senior practitioners under supervision, not available by special authorization, banned outright, on the grounds of the form's ferocity and its direct dependence on dark side emotional states as fuel for its operation. The baseline Form 7 required its practitioner to engage with a category of emotional experience the Jedi considered fundamentally incompatible with their alignment, and the Council's formal answer to that incompatibility was prohibition. Vapad was a variant of that prohibited form. The Council authorized it anyway. The mechanical architecture of Vapad, as documented in legend sources drawing primarily on the novel Shatterpoint, describes the practitioner as one half of a circuit. The opponent's fury, the darkness inherent in them, flows into the practitioner, travels through them, and returns amplified as force directed back at its source. The practitioner doesn't resist that current, they conduct it. They become the mechanism that channels it. But conducting requires a specific psychological state. Vapad demanded the user enjoy the fight, not approach it professionally, not process the violence into calm and controlled technique. Enjoy it. Relish winning. The form asked the practitioner to actively inhabit the emotional reality of combat rather than transcend it. That inhabited emotional state was what its own architect described as operating in the penumbra of the dark side. Those are Mace Windu's words, his own explanation of what Vapad is and why he created it. He developed Vapad to answer his own weakness. It channels his own darkness into a weapon of the light. He acknowledged the darkness. He built an entire combat system around it. He defined the channeling of that darkness as the form's core operational purpose, not a tolerated side effect. The darkness wasn't incidental to Vapad. It was the mechanism the form was engineered to use. And after Windu lobbied the Jedi High Council directly, they authorized Vapad as a sanctioned variant of the form they had already prohibited on exactly these grounds. The Council's logic holds internally. Windu wasn't careless. He understood the danger well enough to keep Vapad under strict personal control. The only student he formally taught it to was his Padawan, Depa Billaba, under conditions he monitored personally. He didn't circulate the form to interested practitioners. He selected students carefully, kept the list extremely short, because he understood firsthand what the edge of Vapad actually felt like, and what happened to people who misjudged it. The Council's authorization was of one extraordinary practitioner's supervised use of a dangerous capability, not a broad institutional endorsement of dark side emotional practice as a general Jedi method. That's a coherent institutional decision. It also established a precedent that needed only one failure to become undeniable as evidence of something. That failure arrived quickly. Sora Bulk, Weequay Jedi Master. At the time of Vapad's creation, described as one of the Order's finest lightsaber practitioners, skilled across all 7 forms. Not a student being evaluated on a new technique, a co-architect. He helped design Vapad from its foundational principles, understood what those principles required from the practitioner, and built the form with Windu as an intellectual equal contributor to its development. He knew exactly what the form was asking of the people who practiced it, because he'd been inside the process of determining what it would ask. In Legends sources, the documentation of what happened to Bulk is direct and specific. Vapad required the user to dance along the edge of the dark side, and Bulk fell captive to the darkness. The Legends record notes that even before Vapad, Bulk harbored a private fascination with the dark side that Windu appears not to have been aware of, a pre-existing orientation that the form's requirement to acknowledge and actively channel darkness gave both structure and permission. He began private explorations beyond his sanctioned practice. The edge the form placed him on became something he approached not as a tool to be managed, but as a destination. What was supposed to transform darkness into light began, in Bulk, doing exactly the reverse. Slowly, privately, with the complete deniability that comes from any fall that happens one incremental step at a time across a long enough period that no single moment looks decisive. Windu processed Bulk's fall by acknowledging guilt for having exposed him to Vapad, then placing the full burden of responsibility on Bulk personally. Vapad didn't master Bulk. Bulk failed to master Vapad. The guilt was genuine enough to state publicly. The institutional conclusion he drew from that guilt was that the individual who fell had been insufficient to the form's demands, not that a form with those demands was an institutional problem. Vapad remained authorized. Windu kept the teaching restriction at exactly 1 student because the lesson he took from Bulk was about personnel selection. The edge itself stayed in place. 2 things about Bulk's fall should be named clearly. First, the specific causal chain connecting Vapad practice to Bulk's fall is a Legends finding. Disney's canon hasn't formally addressed that sequence. Second, Bulk had pre-existing dark side attraction before Vapad entered the picture, meaning the form accelerated something already present rather than generating corruption from nothing. Neither of these facts erases what the Legends documentation records. They add precision to it. One ironic detail belongs here. When Sora Bulk eventually fell completely during the early Clone Wars, the person who completed his turn to the dark side was Dooku. The first documented casualty of Vapad's authorized edge was personally recruited by the man who had left the Order, cataloging exactly this kind of institutional failure. Whether Dooku recognized the symmetry, or whether it was simply an available asset being used, the sources don't say. The 2 forms, placed side by side, create the institutional picture that serves as the framework for everything that follows. A combat discipline built on precision, economy, and the removal of all unnecessary motion. One so philosophically clean it had never produced a cautionary example, had been filed away as a training exercise because the immediate threats made it impractical. Meanwhile, a combat discipline that required its practitioners to actively inhabit dark-side emotional states, that had produced a fallen co-creator in Legends sources, and whose own architect acknowledged required regular traversal of the dark side's edge, had been officially authorized, carefully managed, and elevated as a demonstration of individual mastery the Council was prepared to formally endorse. The precision-based form was historically interesting. The dark side adjacent form was an institutional achievement. Whether Dooku named Windu when he articulated his departure, Vapad sits inside the indictment he spent his career building as the sharpest available expression of the compromise he kept naming. An institution can authorize a lot of things and still claim philosophical integrity. Authorizing, specifically and formally, a combat philosophy that its own practitioner described as channeling personal darkness, after having already banned its parent form for exactly that reason, is the kind of institutional decision that either requires a very good explanation or confirms what the critic has been saying. The Order produced both of these things. It tolerated both. It filed away the safe one as irrelevant and elevated the dangerous one as mastery. Dooku was born around 92 BBY on Sereno. House Sereno, hereditary Outer Rim nobility, land and title and political standing accumulated across generations. A count's title was waiting for him by birthright. The Jedi Order arrived first. He was taken as an infant, as custom required. Force-sensitive children, collected before family bonds could complicate the emotional architecture Jedi training needed to build on. His birth family had a name and territory, and a particular claim on his future. The Order gave him Yoda instead, and for the better part of a century, he accepted the terms of that transaction. The lineage it produced deserves to be named in full sequence. Yoda trained Dooku. Dooku trained Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon trained Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan trained Anakin Skywalker. The entire cascade of consequence that defines the Skywalker saga flows through this single chain of transmission, and it begins with a child from an aristocratic house in the Outer Rim becoming the most analytically precise Jedi of his generation, under the direct tutelage of the Grand Master of the Order. Dooku rose through the institution the way gifted and principled people rise. He mastered Makashi at the highest levels. He took a Padawan in Qui-Gon and trained him in the same disciplined tradition, the same commitment to principle over political convenience, the same understanding that the Jedi's purpose was protecting people rather than maintaining political structures, the same willingness to say what the institution found inconvenient if the evidence required it. Qui-Gon carried that inheritance visibly enough that the Jedi High Council, when evaluating him for membership, found him too independent. He was trained in his master's image. Dooku served on the High Council itself, among the 12 senior masters who set the Order's institutional direction. At the height of that career, he was exactly what the Order's entire apparatus was designed to produce. And then, the Order kept demonstrating that the apparatus and the product had diverged. The grievances are specific, documented in canonical sources, and they require individual treatment rather than summary. Because the argument that Dooku's departure was a methodical conclusion rather than a dramatic break depends on understanding that the evidence didn't arrive in one overwhelming flood. It arrived in increments, over decades, each incident individually manageable and collectively conclusive. Start with Sereno, his homeworld. Hereditary territory, family connections, the land and the title he'd been taken from as an infant. His brother Ramil moved against House Sereno, an armed attack on the planet where Dooku's family lived, and where the Count's title he'd been separated from as a child remained attached to his bloodline. Dooku brought this to the Jedi Council. He had the standing and the seniority to make that request credibly. He wanted the Order to act. The Council's response was that Sereno's tax status and its political alignment with movements the Republic considered separatist placed it outside the parameters the Order was prepared to engage on behalf of. They declined to intervene. Reconstruct what that looked like from Dooku's position. A Jedi Master, one of the 12 on the High Council, not a junior knight making an impractical request, watched his homeworld come under attack and brought it formally to the institution whose foundational stated purpose was protecting people. The institution ran a political compliance calculation and determined that these particular people, on this particular planet, under this particular tax arrangement, didn't meet the threshold that warranted Jedi engagement. His homeworld. The people connected to the title that should have been his. The principle the Order claimed as its foundational identity, Jedi protect people, had just been explicitly subordinated, in a direct exchange with one of the Council's own members, to a question of tax status and political categorization. Dooku was outraged. That's the canonical description. He was outraged, and the record suggests the outrage was proportional. Then Galadron, then Baltazar. Two specific military conflicts, both named in canonical sourcing, where the Jedi's deployment and conduct fell short of what principled guardianship required. The documented framing of these engagements describes the Jedi being used in ways that amounted to military assets serving Republican strategic interests rather than genuinely protecting vulnerable populations. After Galadron in particular, the Jedi's involvement in the conflict produced consequences that troubled Dooku enough to contribute materially to his assessment of the Order-Senate relationship. The specific details of each engagement existed. The pattern across them was consistent enough to be named. Dooku's canonical description of that pattern was that the Jedi's partnership with the Republic had been crippling their ability to be true guardians of peace. Not limiting, not complicating, crippling. The Jedi Order's functional identity had shifted, in his documented assessment, from protecting people to serving a political structure, and that shift had become sufficiently complete that a homeworld attack could be declined for tax reasons, and military deployments could be ordered as what he characterized as disposable attack dogs in conflicts driven by Republican interests rather than genuine human need. The Order wasn't failing occasionally. It had reorganized its institutional priorities around something other than what it claimed to be. Then there was Sifo Dyas. Sifo Dyas was a Jedi Master, one of Dooku's colleagues on the Council, a practitioner with genuine Force sensitivity who brought the Council a specific, documented premonition. A Force vision of catastrophic war approaching, a conflict the Republic was unprepared to face, and that the Jedi would be unable to address without a substantial standing army. He presented this to the Council not as speculation, but as something he had perceived, with the clarity that Force visions, in the Jedi tradition, were understood to carry. He argued that the Republic needed military preparation. He argued it with whatever conviction a vision that specific produces in the person who experienced it. The Council dismissed the proposal. The institutional calculus weighed the resource cost of investigating and preparing against the vision's uncertain timeline, and concluded it wasn't worth it. The Force attunement the Order claimed as its foundational capacity, the specific sensory relationship with reality that justified the Jedi's entire institutional existence, had just been processed through a resource allocation framework and found insufficient to justify action. What Sifo Dyas did next is one of the more consequential decisions in the canon timeline. He went around the Council. Without authorization, using his own standing as a Jedi Master, he contracted the cloners on Kamino to begin producing a Republic army. The Council eventually discovered this and removed him from his position. The army he commissioned would become the Grand Army of the Republic. The war he foresaw would begin at Geonosis in 22 BBY. But in the moment Dooku was observing, the moment that mattered for his accumulating assessment, what had happened was that a man with a genuine Force vision of catastrophic events brought it to an institution whose entire identity depended on Force attunement, and that institution told him the budget didn't support the warning. Dooku would later hijack Sifo Dyas's identity to maintain control of the clone project after his former colleague's death, another layer of irony in an argument that contains more than its share of them. But the relevant moment isn't that one. The relevant moment is a Jedi Master watching a colleague's Force perception dismissed for resource reasons by an institution that claimed the Force as its foundational orientation. That institution was the one Dooku was still serving on the Council. These incidents didn't arrive simultaneously. They accumulated across decades, each one individually processable and collectively conclusive, the way evidence for a diagnosis accumulates in someone methodical enough to keep noting what they see. The Sereno calculation. Galadron and Baltazar. The Senate entanglement eating through the Order's ability to function as anything other than an arm of Republican policy. The Sifo Dyas dismissal. A career on the High Council spent watching the institution he'd given his professional identity to demonstrate, in specific and documented incidents, that it had become something other than what it claimed to be. By the time Dooku formally departed, this wasn't disillusionment in the sense of discovering something was different than expected. It was a concluded diagnosis from someone who had watched the patient long enough to be certain of what was wrong. In canon, Dooku left the Jedi Order in 42 BBY, 10 years before the events of The Phantom Menace. He went to Yoda directly, not through intermediaries, not by simply stopping attending council sessions. He walked to his former master and gave him the full account. The canonical record describes the confrontation as composed. Dooku laid out his reasoning, named the systemic failures he documented, and gave Yoda an honest explanation of why continued membership had become a form of endorsement he could no longer provide. Yoda, according to the canonical sources, understood the reasoning. He was saddened. He accepted it. These aren't the responses of someone who found the argument easily dismissible. They are the responses of someone who could follow the logic and couldn't refute the conclusion. Dooku offered to return his lightsaber. The gesture was formal. A Jedi's weapon returned to the institution as acknowledgement that membership was over. Yoda refused it. Being a Jedi was more than a title. The lightsaber stayed with Dooku, and the refusal contained something that would have been difficult to ignore. The Grand Master of the Order was declining the formal closure Dooku was offering, insisting on a connection the departing man had come to terminate. Whether Yoda believed Dooku might return, or whether the refusal was simply the only response available to someone who understood the reasoning and couldn't change the outcome, the sources don't settle. Dooku left with the lightsaber and without the membership. The Legends continuity places the departure in 32 BBY, the same year Qui-Gon Jinn died at the Battle of Naboo, killed by Darth Maul. In Legends, Qui-Gon's death functions as the weight that tips the balance of a structure already cracked. Losing the Padawan he'd trained, the man who represented his most direct contribution to what the Order was supposed to be, to a Sith opponent the Order hadn't believed was active in the galaxy. Canon and Legends tell different stories about the specific year. Both agree on what kind of departure it was: civil, principled, built from specific documented evidence, accumulated across decades rather than arriving as a sudden break. After leaving, Dooku retained access to the Jedi Temple. He continued visiting. He walked the halls. He wasn't monitored as a threat or followed or treated with institutional suspicion. He was the 20th Jedi Master to voluntarily resign over ideological differences, joining a formal category the Order maintained for such departures, the Lost 20. The Revenge of the Sith novelization characterizes him as the most recent and most painful of those departures, a man whose former peers still held him in high esteem despite their disapproval. An institution that maintains a formal register of its most principled departures, keeps the register updated, and continues operating on the same foundations that produced those departures, is an institution that has made a choice. The list existed. 20 masters had found the institution's stated principles and its actual practices sufficiently incompatible to leave over it. The council continued unchanged. Before Attack of the Clones, Someone erased Kamino's coordinates from the Jedi archives, deleted an entire planetary system from the Order's navigational records, removing critical intelligence about the clone army's location and origin. That someone was Dooku. He had continued accessing the temple after his formal departure, walking its halls with the freedom his civil exit had preserved. And at some point during that continued access, he used it to delete information the Order would need to understand what was approaching. The man who had presented his departure to Yoda in principled, measured terms had traveled, by this point, to a position where the institution holding those records had forfeited the right to them. The reasoning was still consistent. The methods weren't. Yoda understood the departure and was saddened by it, and refused the lightsaber and, based on every canonical source available, never publicly examined what his own role had been in the trajectory that produced it. No source records a moment where the man who trained Dooku asks whether he failed his student, or whether the institution he led for decades bears responsibility for producing the most recent and most painful name on its own register of principled resignations. When they fought in Attack of the Clones, the personal weight in that confrontation was implicit in every exchange. Master versus former student, the physical expression of a relationship that had moved through decades of shared training and genuine mutual regard and principled divergence and a civil departure and a refused lightsaber to open combat. Yoda understood the reasoning. He said so. The accounting for what understanding without action produced, that was never requested from either direction. In 42 BBY, the same year Dooku formally left the Order in canon, he was introduced to Senator Sheev Palpatine. The introduction came through Jedi Master Rael Averross, a Jedi serving as the connection point between a recently departed Jedi Master and the man who was already, from a senator's office, quietly engineering the collapse of the Republic and the Order simultaneously. Neither party understood the full picture when the introduction was made. The canonical timeline records it anyway, without comment. Palpatine didn't reveal himself as Darth Sidious at that first meeting. He was genuinely uncertain about Dooku's allegiances, unwilling to expose his Sith identity to someone whose commitment against the Order hadn't fully calcified, who might still be persuaded back by the right overture, or might, if alarmed, report what he'd encountered. So he waited. He presented as a senator who shared Dooku's documented concerns about corruption and the Jedi Senate entanglement, a powerful political figure who understood the Republic's failures in precisely the terms Dooku had spent his career naming. He let the disillusionment continue developing on its own momentum, which required no assistance, because the disillusionment had been built from entirely genuine institutional failures across 4 decades of service and had no natural terminus. What followed over the years between 42 BBY and the events of the Phantom Menace was graduated engagement rather than immediate revelation. Labyrinth of Evil describes Palpatine as teasing Dooku along, suggesting ongoing active contact rather than passive waiting for circumstances to develop. He found moments to deepen the association. He appeared adjacent to Dooku's thinking, without yet proposing the relationship he was building toward. The canonical analyses of Palpatine's methodology across the prequel era characterize the pattern consistently. He exploits and exacerbates conditions already in play, cunningly stokes existing disillusionment without manufacturing new material from nothing, and positions himself as the available solution to damage he didn't create. He was a harvester. What he found in Dooku was a field someone else, the Jedi Order itself, had been preparing for 4 decades. When the full offer came, it was calibrated precisely to the wound the Order had left. Palpatine presented himself as the person willing to act against the corrupt Republic, the exact institutional entanglement Dooku had spent his career documenting as the root of the Order's failure to function as anything other than a political instrument. He didn't offer Dooku darkness in the abstract. He offered purposeful action against the specific corruption Dooku had already diagnosed and named and documented in detail. The wound was entirely real. The diagnosis was accurate. The only false element was the suggestion that Palpatine intended to address the corruption, rather than consolidate all the power the corruption had accumulated into his own office. Palpatine never invested in Dooku the way he had invested in Darth Maul. Canonical sources note he trained Dooku minimally. Dooku arrived already as a considerably powerful Jedi Master who required no foundational formation in the way a lifelong Sith apprentice would. He wasn't shaped as a long-term successor. He was elevated as a political instrument, given the identity of Darth Tyrannus, positioned as the public face of a separatist movement, and used to architect exactly the kind of galaxy-scale fracture that served Palpatine's consolidation strategy, while keeping Palpatine himself visible only as a senator navigating a crisis he was generating. The Darth Vader-era comics record a distinction Palpatine drew between his apprentices with specific emotional weight. Darth Maul was described as a true loss. Dooku, in Palpatine's private assessment, was reduced to something closer to a directed weapon, a proton torpedo with a Count's title and a principled ideological cover story, pointed at the Republic and eventually expendable. One was mourned. The other was designed from the beginning to be discarded when the next phase of the plan required it. Dooku spent the years between his departure and Attack of the Clones fronting the separatist movement, commissioning the clone army under the hijacked identity of Sifo Dyas, the colleague whose force vision the Council had dismissed for resource reasons, and architecting a galaxy-scale fracture that served Palpatine's consolidation strategy in ways Dooku appears not to have fully understood. The most analytically precise observer of his generation, the man who had diagnosed the Order's capacity for institutional self-deception with greater clarity than any of his peers, had been inserted into a self-deception of his own, one constructed by the person he was supposedly working alongside against corruption. He had spent 40 years identifying the Order's capacity for self-deception. He didn't identify his own. Palpatine ran the same structural play on Anakin Skywalker roughly a decade later. The comparison illuminates the predatory architecture rather than just adding a parallel example. The design was identical. Identify an existing damage the institution has failed or refused to address. Present yourself as the only available source of the remedy. Offer the specific thing the institution has explicitly withheld. With Dooku, a career of genuine institutional failures, an order choosing political convenience over its stated purpose, and an offer of meaningful, purposeful action against the corruption he documented across decades. With Anakin, the terror of losing Padme, a fear the Jedi had explicitly told him was an emotional problem he needed to correct, rather than a legitimate need they could address, and an offer of the knowledge that could directly address it. In Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine told Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord who had learned to manipulate midichlorians, to create life, and to keep the ones he cared about from dying. He framed this knowledge as real and potentially accessible to someone with the right commitment. He implied the Jedi would never offer it because it didn't serve their purposes for Anakin to have it. Whether Plagueis' knowledge was fully real, partially real, or constructed around a genuine historical claim while the promise of access was entirely fabricated, sources suggest Palpatine's manipulation was built around a half-truth rather than pure invention. But the structure of the play isn't contested. Here is the wound you are already carrying. Here is the knowledge the institution you trusted has refused to provide, and I am the only person willing to help you with it. Dooku had lived through the earlier draft of that same sentence. The wound was different, institutional rather than personal, accumulated over decades rather than acute and urgent. The offer was different, political purpose rather than private salvation. The predatory architecture was identical both times. Palpatine found existing damage in both men. He named it accurately. He positioned himself as the remedy. The accuracy of his diagnosis of what they'd been denied was what made the offer credible. Both men were right about what the institution had failed to provide them, and both were wrong about who was offering to address it. The question the canonical sources leave genuinely open is whether Palpatine found those conditions waiting for him or partly arranged them. His multi-decade conspiracy against the Jedi Order is documented. He actively degraded the Order's ability to perceive the Force during those years. The canonical record describes deliberate, systematic clouding of the Jedi's Force attunement as part of his long game. His conspiracy aimed at consolidating political, religious, and military authority into a single office, and it required the Jedi to fail at precisely the right moments across a very long timeline. He understood the Order's institutional fault lines from the outside, in detail, for decades before those fault lines produced the outcomes he needed. Darth Maul was dispatched to Naboo in 32 BBY. Palpatine ordered that mission. Maul killed Qui-Gon Jinn. In the Legends continuity, Qui-Gon's death is the event that catalyzed Dooku's full commitment to the Sith path, meaning a mission Palpatine directly ordered, produced, as a documented downstream consequence, the complete turn of the apprentice he'd already been cultivating for years. Whether Palpatine intended that specifically, whether the death of Qui-Gon was calculated with Dooku's trajectory in mind, is something no canonical source answers. The timing exists. The documented intent behind it's absent. No source confirms that Palpatine engineered the Council's tolerance of Vapad as part of his long game. No source confirms he deliberately sustained the Order's political entanglement with the Senate, specifically to produce the conditions Dooku would observe and conclude from. The broad conspiracy is canonical. Its specific influence on the particular institutional failures that built Dooku's departure across 4 decades isn't documented. Both readings follow from what the evidence contains, and both should be stated clearly. In the first, Palpatine was an extraordinarily capable opportunist with predatory timing and the patience to wait for the right moment to act on what he found. The Jedi Order was failing entirely on its own, authorizing a dark side-adjacent combat philosophy under controlled exception for one exceptional practitioner, maintaining a formal register of its most principled resignations and continuing unchanged, dismissing Force visions for resource reasons, declining to defend a council member's homeworld for tax reasons, filing away the form built on analytical precision as a historical artifact, while elevating the form built on channeling darkness as an individual achievement. Dooku reached his conclusions through his own process, across real and genuine failures, without any assistance. The rot was organic. Palpatine found it, named it accurately, and harvested it at the optimal moment. In the second, the rot was real, but may not have been entirely organic. A Sith Lord actively degrading the Order's Force perception for decades, dispatching agents who killed figures directly connected to Dooku's development, intimately familiar with the institutional fault lines from outside. That person could have been incrementally maintaining the conditions Dooku encountered, not manufacturing the Sereno crisis or the Senate entanglement from nothing. Ensuring the Council remained distracted enough, the political compromises just corrosive enough, the institutional blindness sufficiently preserved, that a man with Dooku's analytical precision would reach the departure point on Palpatine's preferred schedule, rather than earlier, or never. If the second reading is correct, then Dooku wasn't only right about the Order. He was also a victim of the same predator he later served. The clearest-eyed observer of his generation had his observations shaped, at least in part, by the person who needed him to see exactly enough to walk out. The diagnosis was genuine. The conditions that produced the diagnosis may not have been entirely accidental. The man who had spent his career identifying the Order's self-deception had been guided, with extraordinary precision, to see the Order's self-deception by someone who needed him to see it. The canonical sources don't close that question. Both readings are supported by different parts of the evidence, and the gap between them is genuine, rather than rhetorical. What both readings agree on completely is the Council's response to everything Dooku documented, to Sifo-Dyas's dismissed vision, to the Sereno calculation, to the 20 Jedi Masters who eventually found the institution's principles and its practices sufficiently incompatible to resign over it, including the most recent and most painful entry, the man who continued walking the temple halls after resigning, and eventually used that access to delete their maps. The Council maintained the register. It continued building the institutions he had criticized. It certified the combat philosophy whose co-creator had fallen to the darkness, the form required every practitioner to stand adjacent to. It filed 20 names and kept the register accurate. Whatever Palpatine engineered or merely found waiting for him at exactly the right moment, the Jedi Order's answer to Dooku's diagnosis was the same either way. Nothing. The Clone Wars chronological series, Year 1 through Year 4, is linked below. The Mace Windu and Form 7 episode is in that playlist and covers the Council's side of this exact argument. Subscribe if this kind of analysis is what brings you here.